The Wellington North Cultural Roundtable presents A Cultural Moment, the history of newspapers in Mount Forest. In 1860, it was easy to read all the newspapers published in Wellington County. However, none were published in the North. As with most things at that time, the North was dependent on the outside for its news, but this did not remain the case for long. Tom Greenham, publisher of the British Constitution in Fergus, started his second paper in Mount Forest and named it The Express in late 1860 or early 1861. This venture did not last long, undoubtedly a victim of poor advertising revenues. Its place was soon occupied by the Mount Forest Examiner, which appeared in April 1862 and was published by Tom Graff. Another paper hit the Mount Forest streets in April 1867. This was The Confederate, published by the father and son team of Henry and Harry Stovall. A modest paper at 2 pages, it first appeared only bi-weekly. By the second year, though, The Confederate had established itself as a solid paper, a standard 4-page weekly with ample advertising. In the meantime, Graff sold the Examiner. New owners carried on through the 1870s, but in 1880, the Stovalls bought it out. The Confederate had by this time become the dominant paper in Mount Forest, and indeed in North Wellington. The Stovalls enjoyed a monopoly only briefly. Later in 1880, E.G. Hart started a new paper, the Mount Forest Advocate. This paper lasted until 1890. 4 years later, the Stovalls sold the Confederate to Henry Benner. Apparently, they had some difference with the new owner. Within weeks of the sale, they had started a new paper, the Mount Forest Index. Then, in 1885, Jim Lambert established yet another paper, the Representative. For the next year, Mount Forest enjoyed the luxury of 4 newspapers, but there was not enough advertising for any of them to prosper. The Stovalls bailed out first, closing down the Index in 1886. Many towns the size of Mount Forest boasted 2 newspapers in this era. The Confederate and the Representative coexisted for almost 30 years until 1918, when rising costs claimed the Representative. It was purchased by A.W. Wright, who had taken over the Confederate in 1902. The Confederate would remain the lone weekly Mount Forest-focused newspaper of record until April 2016, when Chris Holden launched the Mount Forest Mirror. For the next 18 months, the Confederate and the Mirror were both published weekly. The Mirror published its last issue in October 2017. In the summer of 2019, Metroland Media sold the Confederate and other local papers to Midwestern Newspapers Corporation. The Confederate was replaced by the Independent Plus without advance notice in September 2019, ending its 152-year history without fanfare or celebration. In January 2020, the Wellington Advertiser purchased a 50% stake in Midwestern Newspapers and replaced the Independent Plus with the North Wellington Community News, a regional paper which serves Mapleton, Minto, and Wellington North. Despite its long history of local journalism, Mount Forest no longer has a weekly newspaper to call its own. Today, residents rely on regional publications and digital media for their weekly news, marking the end of an era for Mount Forest's once thriving newspaper scene.